During the mid-1930s, the Fokker company started work on a new twin-engine fighter that could serve both as an air superiority fighter as well as a bomber interceptor with heavy firepower. The twin-engined heavy fighter concept was kind of in vogue at the time, and the new plane used a twin-engined twin-boom layout that incorporated a defensive gun turret into the rear of the fuselage. The generous amount of empty space inside the aircraft also allowed for a bomb bay or room for a third crew member. As was common at the time, the plane used mixed wood and metal construction, and the first flight was in 1937. There were some issues with the engines, but its performance was seen as good enough to justify more work both for the Dutch Air Force and potential export sales. A few small production orders were made using either the Bristol Mercury or Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp Jr. engines, as well as a small number of dedicated dive bombers for Sweden. In total, only around 60 were built, with the Royal Netherlands Air Force being the first operator. However, Germany invaded just as production was starting to ramp up, and the G1s were pushed into service without any foreign deliveries being completed. There were some limited air combat engagements, with the Fokkers scoring a few kills and suffering a few losses, but the exact count is mostly guesswork, since detailed records really weren't being kept. After the Dutch surrender, a small number were captured by the Germans and used in non-combat roles until the spare parts dried up. None were operational past the end of the war. What we get in Warthunder is the Fokker G.Ia, which is the version powered by the Bristol Mercury engine. This is a strike aircraft in Rank 2 of the French Air Tree at Battle Rating 2.3. Being a 1930s design, the plane doesn't get any advanced combat systems, but it does get a telescopic gun sight and a conventional optical bomb sight. The plane's primary armament is a set of 8 7.92mm machine guns mounted in a row up in the front of the nose, with a total of 4,000 rounds of ammo. This is a huge amount of concentrated firepower for Rank 2, and the Fokker also has another machine gun in a tail gun position. In addition to this, the plane has an internal bomb bay with a few different options for dumb bombs, ranging in sizes from 50 to 400 kilograms. In terms of flight performance, the G.Ia is kinda average. It feels like it's somewhere in between a 1 and a 2 engine fighter. It's got a pretty typical rate of climb, and it accelerates well enough, but its agility is basically just average. It can outturn some of its opposition, but a fair amount of single-engine fighters can still get inside of its circle without a lot of trouble. The rate of roll is fairly good at most airspeeds, and it can pull into some snap turns better than you might expect from a twin-engine fighter. It's got a couple of genuine issues, though. First, the rudder response is really poor, which makes aiming adjustments in a turn kinda sloppy, and you really shouldn't throw the combat flaps out over about 400 kilometers an hour. The controls lock up pretty hard in a dive, and it doesn't have air brakes or anything, so make sure you watch your speed and your throttle when you're zooming down on someone. Now, as with most strike aircraft, it's worth mentioning that if you load up the bomb bay, it can have a pretty noticeable impact on the plane's flight performance. If you want to take this out as a ground pounder, I'd suggest avoiding combat until you've dropped your bomb, or if you get jumped, just consider dumping it anyway to focus on air combat. Again, kinda to sum it all up, the flight performance on this plane just feels incredibly average. That's not a bad thing at all, it's just average. Taking the G.Ia up into air battles gives you some good options on how to proceed. The plane is classed as a strike aircraft, so it gets an air spawn in RB, which lets you make a dash for the bombing targets or AI ground units if you want to do actual ground pounding before looking for fights, or you can skip the bombing and just go right into air combat. Both are perfectly viable options with this plane. I personally had fairly good luck with this plane climbing up to do bomber interception, and if enemy fighters don't climb up for escort, the huge cluster of guns on this plane can get you some bomber kills easier than most other planes at this BR. The Universal Belt seems to be the best ammo for bomber hunting, and it does a really good job at starting fires. My personal preference for points grinding is usually to take the larger 400 kilogram bomb and go dump it on a base or a cluster of light ground targets as a way to kinda guarantee a baseline level of points for a match. Then, go do mid or low level air combat. This seems to work pretty well, but just keep in mind that the plane is somewhat vulnerable to boom and zoom stuff, since it's a larger target than a lot of other fighters. If your preference is just to focus on air combat, consider doing the usual climb to win meta and hunting for bombers or lower flying aircraft to pounce on. The G.1A isn't the best at high altitude dogfights, and some of the more specialized high altitude planes like the MiG-3 will usually be able to outmaneuver you without a whole lot of trouble, but it's hardly a struggle bus, and if you can get a head-on with someone, you've got a really good chance of a pilot snipe just from the quantity of shots coming out of those 8 machine guns. Flying close air support is another great role for this plane, as the optical bomb sight can make accurate drops fairly easy, and air combat over a ground battle can be really fun and faster paced due to the smaller map sizes. I really enjoyed flying this plane out doing fighter sweeps and hunting for Stukas, and the huge firepower made it easier to take out enemy strikers before they got their bombs out. When I could catch them anyway. Visually, the Fokker G1 is a really weird looking plane. Usually I'm a big fan of the oddballs like this, but for whatever reason, that stubby nose and the shape of the tail just kind of ruins it for me. Only one paint job, but at least the 3D model is well detailed. Landing is fairly simple, but a few things to remember. The gear drops pretty slowly, and the plane only has one tail wheel. You can drop landing flaps at about 230 kilometers an hour, and you can safely lock up the brakes on touching down without much of a risk of a nose-over. The cockpit on this plane is another low-poly placeholder. It has good visibility and the instruments are easy to read, but the inside is just flat surfaces. The scope view doesn't really work very well for me, and I can't recommend this cockpit for VR. To close out with the Fokker G.1A. This plane has insane forward firepower concentrated right in the center line. It gets an air spawn in RB, it's got a rear gunner, and an internal bomb bay. However, it's got a really lazy rudder. The final verdict on the Fokker G.1A is that this plane feels incredibly average other than the heavy firepower. It's fun to fly and a great addition to low-tier French lineups, but you may end up replacing it quickly as planes with better flight performance become available. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.